fastest growing one, part-time faculty, all right, in these institutions. And you've heard about the dilemma of part-time faculty members, which is the oddest thing, given our culture in higher education, that we would be the institutions who have the greatest rate of labor exploitation of any other organization within our capitalist system. Isn't that ironic? These people work at extremely low wages with no benefits, all right? And of course, a contract faculty member is somebody who's not on the tenure track, all right? And then the other thing you see throughout this period here is substantial, persistent secular declines in the number of non-professional staff for 102s. Clerical, maintenance, all that's been going down. So in other words, the institutions have been economizing on the use of, heavily economizing the use of non-professionals and pouring lots of money into professional, non-academic staff. Now, how does that translate into the governance structure in these things, in these institutions? Well, in 1987, the ratio of full-time, non-academic professional staff to tenure-track faculty was about 1-to-1 in public institutions, okay? Now, it was over 1-to-1. It was like 1.5-to-1 in the private institutions. By 2008, that ratio was over 1.5-to-1. So, substantial change in the ratios of professional, non-academic employees and tenure-track faculty. These are the actual ratios for 1987 for public research universities, private research universities, and my colleges, okay, like Center College. And you see what's going on in all three of them. That ratio has increased substantially. So everybody. It's not just the research universities that are doing that. My schools, Center College, has been doing the same thing. Spending more effort to expand the non-academic employees, professional employees, over the tenure-track faculty. Okay. Now, before I get to the last slide here, you thought I would never end. I want to make a point here. Remember, our fundamental mission is not to provide lazy rivers to students. Our mission is instruction and research. I mean, that is the primary reason why we exist. It is why we have tax-exempt status. It is why we have people willing to make charitable donations to us. Now, I will ask you this question. The staffing pattern that you just saw, is that consistent with a full-bore emphasis on instruction and research? So what would it suggest might happen to the quality of undergraduate instruction during this period? So it shows up in the numbers you can't fudge, which are the nose counts that are being employed by these institutions. All right, it's right there in that. The emphasis has been away from the academics and toward bundled services. In other words, all the other things that we're doing in institutions. Now, final slide here. For at least the past 100 years, we have had a social contract between, intergenerational social contract, between the current adult generation and the emerging young generation. And that social contract said that we, the old folks, will subsidize your education, K through 12, all the way up through college and universities, with the understanding that you will pay it back to the generation that follows you, right? That's the way we funded higher education for over the past 100 years. Now, those of us who are academic insiders were the stewards of that contract. We are the ones who were supposed to make sure that when came time for the young people to pass the subsidy on to someone else, that the cost they would have to bear would be reasonable and that the quality would be appropriate to the burden we're placing on them for the next generation. Now, I'm going to admit I'm part of this problem, okay? Last 40 years of my experience with higher education, you know, I contributed to these problems. I became increasingly worried about it. I knew I was doing it. I started out life at a Carnegie One research institution where the tenure standards were very high and promotion standards in general were high and competition for raises were very high. And of course, the way you got tenure, the way you got raises was by research output, period. All right? In most Carnegie One institutions, basically, the emphasis on research output because they're all trying to compete for rising in the quality standards because that brings in more money brings in all kinds of benefits to everybody in the institution. I became increasingly alarmed and worried about what we were doing to the undergraduates during that period. So after my first wife died, I decided I'll move around a little bit and see what's going on elsewhere. And that's how I moved around to other institutions, UT Arlington after that, and then to Center. After I got to UT Arlington, it was so much worse than anything I've experienced anywhere else. I thought, well, surely in the private institutions, they will be much more cognizant of these problems because they're much closer to the marketplace because they're having to deal without a lot of public support. And I found out, well, no, not really. Okay? They have an entirely different set of problems that are not exactly the same as the research institutions do. So I guess this is my conclusion with regard to this. Those of us who are the stewards have failed in this. And this is what I was saying about going back and reading Baumel's book in the late 90s and realizing, oh my God, it was there all along. Because he had done all the background work. You know, he had done a complete statistical analysis of costs across all different types of colleges and universities, and the relationships and the things that I've been talking about here were all there. What was lacking was an inductive approach because he looked at the data first and tried to figure out what he could do that. He didn't have a theory. He didn't have a theory for what all of this does. And why does this happen? So what I did in my book, which was probably the second book on this topic, which was published in 2011, The College Cost Disease, was to provide a theoretical structure. And that's what I've been talking about here, to explain the cost drivers, the principal point that I had there. Okay, so that's really the nexus of what I had to say to you tonight. If you have questions, I'd be delighted to answer any questions you might have. Yes?
More of a footnote style question. Most of us are familiar with the word secular in a theological sense, not in any sense economic. That's why. What does it
in a statistical sense, it means a long-term trend, covering several decades.
What would be the antonym in economics?
The opposite, well, let's see, be a short-run business cycle of some sort. Okay. A short-run effect. Yes?
Do you see any potential actions that any of the actors involved, the faculty, the public, the government, can or should take to reverse the inefficiencies of all education?
Well, one of the reasons, I'm glad you asked that question. I'm really sincerely glad you asked that question because it explains part of my personal history. One of the reasons why I decided to retire early, before I actually had to, was I came to the realization that reform is not going to take place inside higher education. There just is no incentive to do that. The only way it's going to take place is now, because it's too late, okay? It's too, whoever impacted on this, it's going to have to come from the outside. It's going to have to be the government doing it. It's going to have to be public interest groups doing it. And so you can see a lot of those people barricading the streets right now, so to speak, on this issue. And because they understand the connection between higher ed and mobility and income distributions and all that. Yeah.
So one of the subsets of public education that you didn't specifically talk about was the role of community colleges.
Yeah.
And how community colleges play a factor in this, or the potential for community colleges to force the change.
Well,
I mean, not force the change, but
yeah,
play a role.
you know that
Yeah.
the community colleges are certainly not going to have forced change on U of L, right?
But in some states,
Yeah,
it's
but
very
they have
different.
an important role to play here. But what I'm trying to get at is that we're all influenced in terms of things we will and will not do by our peer institutions. You know, that's where the competition comes from. And we benchmark to those peers. One of the interesting things about the way we benchmark, however, is that we benchmark to the highest cost provider.